So I'm Emily, the VCHA's Director of Outreach. I've just got a few quick things of note before I'm turning you over to tonight's speaker, Teal, who is the BCHA's Research Coordinator. So tonight, I want to acknowledge that both Teal and I are coming to you from the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be on this shared territory, although I was not invited to do so. Tonight's talk is entitled The Arbiters of Faith, Prayer in the BC Legislature and Religious Entanglement. A quick couple of housekeeping notes. Given today's turnout, everyone has been muted to prevent any inadvertent interruptions, but during the Q&A at the end of tonight's event, feel free to use the chat, as I mentioned earlier, to ask any questions you might have, and our speaker will definitely address them. So we're recording this talk, and it will be released on YouTube and on our podcast next week, and you can find that on our social media when it's up. So our next special virtual event, a panel on climate justice, is coming out on October 8th. So please keep an eye on our newsletter and social media for information about how to RSVP to that. And yeah, so I'll let Teal introduce himself and take it away from here.
Right. Everybody hear me okay, I hope? Excellent. Hi, I'm Dr. Teal Phelps Bonderoff. I'm the research coordinator for the BCHA. And I've popped a link to my website in the chat there for anyone who's interested in keeping up to date on the various publications that the BCHA has had, as well as some of my other work. I do other things, everything from marine conservation to placemaking to access to contraception. So rather than go into all of those, you're welcome to check out my website at your leisure. And you're also welcome to live tweet. I'm at TealPB, and the BC Humanist is, I think, BC Humanists. And please do let the world know about what we're up to. And right, so today's talk is about some of the challenges that the government faces when it starts to erode the separation of religion and government. And we're specifically looking at the case study of the BC Legislature and prayer in the BC Legislature. So the talk is based on an article that I co-authored with Ian Bushfield, who looks like he just joined the chat here and is currently taking up my entire screen. And we worked on this paper, and it was published in, bring it up for you here. It's published in the Journal of Secularism and Non-Religion. So if anyone's interested in taking a deeper dive into the paper itself, you're welcome to take a look at it. It's not behind a paywall, fortunately, and we take a lot more detailed exploration of some of the subjects there. And the other link I'm going to put, just while I'm on the topic of doing links, is a lot of this work is based on previous research that the BCHA has conducted as well, which is ongoing, into prayer in the BC Legislature in general. And last year we released the House of Prayers report, which is a very detailed quantitative analysis of prayer in the BC Legislature. And this report kind of stems from that. But before we do, a bit of background. So basically, daily sittings of the BC Legislature begin with prayer. The prayer is delivered by an MLA, or on days when there is a speech from the throne by a guest. And those guests are typically members of clergy or Indigenous folks. Now, MLAs, when they are given the option of delivering a prayer, may deliver a prayer of their own devising, or they may deliver a prayer that from a list of 5 sample prayers. So just as a bit of background from the House of Prayer study, when we did analyze these prayers, we found 50% of the prayers tended to be prayers from the list of sample prayers, and that the prayers were disproportionately religious. Where we could identify the religion, they were disproportionately Christian. There are fewer MLAs delivering prayers, and the prayers themselves are getting longer. So basically, that's the summary. If you're interested in much more information on the prayers themselves, please do look at our House of Prayers report, because we do involve, it's an extensive report, which I'm quite proud of. So basically, as part of the process of reviewing these prayers, the background of the report is basically this. We were reaching out to the Office of the Clerk to get more information about how prayer worked in the BC Legislature. And when we did that, they informed us they were currently doing a consultation process around prayer. And we participated in that, and the House of Prayers study was our submission to that committee. So they were probably not expecting a 138-page report as our submission, but I'm quite pleased that we got that in. And this was sort of part of an ongoing process. Now, this is in August 2019. We were really pleased to be part of the consultation. A lot of times when governments are consulting with faith traditions and religious groups, they don't include humanists and non-religious people. So this is kind of a bit of an outlier in that process. But of course, when we started looking at the process itself, after we submitted our report looking at the prayers, we realized that it was really not possible for the clerk to engage in this process in any way, both from a practical perspective and from a constitutional perspective. At every possible stage of the process, the clerk would have been in the position of making decisions they were not capable of making, nor constitutionally capable of making. So this was sort of a concern that we had, and so this is where the paper emerged. Ian and I developed the paper out of that ongoing conversation around how is it possible for the clerk to review this list of sample prayers. I do have an update before we get into actual content. So since this paper was published and since our report came out, there have been two big changes in the BC Legislature as relates to prayer itself. The first is in November 2019, the BC Legislature unanimously voted to amend their standing orders so that prayers are now prayers and reflections. So it's sort of a nominative change, and we actually have a book chapter coming out that explores how this nominative change actually impacted the content of the prayers themselves. So that's a talk for maybe a few months from now. But the second aspect was that the Office of the Clerk expanded their list. Unbeknownst to us, when we finished the paper off, they now have a list of sample prayers that's been expanded, and it includes representation from different faith traditions, as well as an expanded list of sample prayers that are sort of non-denominational in air quotes. So those are kind of two of the major changes that have occurred. But generally speaking, and we're still not really sure how that process went about, simply because there's too many stages along the way. There's too much peril along that path. And so what our paper does is it looks at that process. And that's kind of what I'm going to dive into today, is take sort of a deep walk through how could the clerk possibly explore these different questions, and both from a practical and from a constitutional perspective. Generally speaking, though, the inclusion of prayer in the BC Legislature is a violation of the state's duty of religious neutrality. So regardless of how a sample prayer is devised, or if sample prayers are abolished and MLAs deliver prayers on their own, the inclusion of prayer in the BC Legislature or in any legislature in Canada certainly violates the state's duty of religious neutrality. There is a question of whether this ability to discriminate against non-believers and exclude people from other faith traditions is protected by parliamentary privilege, and that's something that's going to have to ultimately be decided by the courts at some point. But until then, it's pretty clear that this is a violation of separation of religion and government. So back to the general practice then. And by the way, if you do have questions as we're going along, please do pop them in the chat, because we may be more difficult to go back to anything that does come up. So when we analyzed the prayers in the BC Legislature, going back to 2003, we found that about 50% of them were sample prayers. That means MLAs tend to rely on sample prayers about half of the time. Interestingly, some MLAs will do a bit of mix and match, so they'll read prayer 3 and prayer 4 and mix the two together, and New Democrat MLAs are much more likely to do that. In addition to the sample prayers, or to sort of generic prayers that MLAs choose to deliver on their own, MLAs also read poetry, they'll deliver quotes, they'll overtly proselytize. Some of them will acknowledge traumatic events that have happened recently, whether provincial events or perhaps the death in a family or a sickness of an MLA's family member. And then we've also noticed a few strange outliers, including MLAs using the opportunity of delivering prayers to threaten a union or to thank God for shipping contracts. So it kind of runs gamut of quite a lot of different aspects. The original 5 prayer sample list, when you look at them, they're all of sort of an Abrahamic faith basis. They all end in amen, and they're all sort of overtly religious in some way. We did code a couple of them as secular, insofar as they didn't mention a God overtly, but they all kind of come from a similar faith tradition. And this is a trend that we notice where there's an attempt to include other faith traditions in public settings like this. And we notice that this tends to be wherein the dominant religion, which in this case is Christianity, tends to see other religious traditions or non-religion as guests in that space. And there's this unspoken understanding as to what religion is. And the measuring stick for religion tends to be Christianity, and other religions are compared to it, which makes it very difficult for perhaps unconventional, or in air quotes, New Age, or even just other faith traditions that don't have the similar structure to Christianity to be recognized as religions and to be seen as welcome in a specific space. So this raises the fundamental question, this is sort of the more constitutional part of the talk, about what is religion? And we really don't have good definitions about this. In the academic world, it is a contested definition as to what a religion is. And when the state makes a decision or sets a definition of what is a religion, they're inherently excluding other groups that perhaps are borderline cases or not religions. And in doing so, they're validating some religions over others. Anytime the state draws a line, it's excluding some and including others. But the question is, does the state have the ability to do that? So there's some jurisprudence on this. I'm going to dive into this a little bit. And so for those of you who are perhaps not as keen on some of the more technical legal aspects, this is the part where you can maybe check your email. But it is quite fundamental. You know, deciding what is a religion is fundamental to all of this conversation because everything stems from that. So ultimately, though, the jurisprudence tells us that it's inappropriate for states to judge what counts as a religion. And anytime there's competing views, the state ultimately would be picking a side in drawing a line. You know, for example, ask the Scientologist or perhaps a Scientologist lawyer if their tradition is a religion, right? There's these contested definitions, and if the state defines one group as a religion and not another, it's inherently excluding. So the other thing we notice is that a lot of attempts to define religion are grounded in a Judeo-Christian understanding of what is a religion. So this is sort of the fundamental benchmark, and everything else is held up to it. But that again it seems wrong because you're basically saying, here's our definition of religion, here's our idea of what religion is, and we're going to hold up other things to it, which is problematic. And there's a lot of spiritual beliefs that are excluded when you do this. In the United States, there's a famous case, Employment Division versus Smith, where an indigenous practice of smoking peyote for spiritual purposes was deemed to not be an acceptable religious practice, and therefore individuals who were fired for failing their drug tests were allowed to be fired, even though they were practicing a traditional spiritual practice. And so then, you know, that's the states here. So what is the definition in Canada, right? This then, there's a couple of cases that Ian and I look at in the paper to try to suss out what definition the Canadian government has for religion. And you notice in a lot of places, the definitions are circular. So they'll say, like, a religion is, you know, a religious practice. And you're like, well, what does that mean? It's spiritual practice. What does that mean? So the two cases that we look at for the paper are charitable status and solemnizing marriages. The first one's pretty important because a lot of religious traditions and religious groups get tax exemptions for being religious. So you'd think there'd be a very firm definition. So when you look at the Canadian Revenue Agency, the CRA, their exemption, they offer an exemption for groups that advance religion or for the advancement of religion. I'm going to read this for folks because the wording is very interesting. To advance religion in the charitable sense means to promote the spiritual teachings of a religious body and to maintain doctrines and spiritual observances on which those teachings are based. There must be an element of theistic worship, which means the worship of a deity or deities in the spiritual sense. So you can see by this definition, they're trying to be inclusive. But again, you have a baseline being a very specific baseline. And they're inherently excluding non-theistic religions. Those are religions that perhaps don't necessarily worship an entity with personality, but perhaps appreciate the universe. And this came up recently in a case around the Church of Atheism in the eastern part of Canada, where the judge acknowledged in this case that this current definition and current definitions like it exclude religious traditions like Buddhism, which don't really have theistic worship. So again, you kind of have this using Protestantism as a baseline and then mildly adjusting it to accommodate other traditions. But in so doing, you're still excluding lots of different traditions. So then perhaps what about solemnizing marriages, right? We grant the ability for many religious institutions to grant marriages. Well, the Marriage Act says that it includes any church or any religious denomination, sect, congregation, or society can help grant marriages. So again, we see an inherent bias here. The definition itself says any church or, and then provides other definitions. Why include that at all if that's not your benchmark for evaluating what is a religion? So it's kind of a bit of a giveaway there. And in addition to that, a lot of other religious traditions don't have a church in the same sense as Christianity does. The church means something very specific in Christianity and means something very specific to different sects of Christianity. It's not just a building. Sometimes it's a community. Sometimes it's an actual hierarchical structure. That's not the way that the church in other religious traditions work, or a temple or what have you. So there's some other problems around the definitions around solemnizing marriage, and not to go into too much detail into these, but they often require an organization they do require an organization to be around for 5 years and show stability and growth and continued vitality. This is a problem for new traditions, and it's a bias towards religious traditions that have a structure or that are lasting. So briefly surveying some of the jurisprudence in Canada, we get a couple of big cases. And these are cases that you'll hear Ian and I and other BC humanists talk about in various other research projects that we have. And you'll hear lawyers talk about a lot as well. The first is Big M Drug Mart. This is 1985, and it relates to the Lord's Day Act, which prohibited people from doing business on Sunday. And in this case, the court said that the government can't decide the validity of a religious claim. In other words, if a religious claim is presented to the government, they can't say that's a good religious claim, that's not a good religious claim. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because ultimately, religion is very personal, it's very subjective. And for one person to say, I think, my religious tradition is building a sukkah on my patio, and for another person to say, my religious tradition is eating a certain kind of food, it's not really the role of the state to determine whether those are valid religious traditions, because they are for people who practice them. And, there was a famous quote of saying, I think it was Elizabeth I said that, the state doesn't have a window into people's souls. You can't know if someone is sincere in their belief or if it's a real religious belief, again, in air quotes. So, the Big M drug mart decision makes sense. We see some other jurisprudence layering on to that. One of those is Syndicat Northcrest versus Amsterdam. This is 2004, and this relates to building a sukkah on a balcony of a strata property. And in this case, the judge said that the state is in no position, nor should it be, to be the arbiter of religious dogma. Again, there was a conflict over what was a valid religious practice. And the court was like, we're not in a position to tell you what is a valid religious practice. And you run into a lot of different problems, right? Because not only is religion subjective, but you ask questions like, okay, do we ask a religious authority? Do we rely on a book? Or do we ask people about their own personal practices? Now, this was a case, this exact question came up in the Amsterdam case. So this is another case where you have, where you have this question of, like what constitutes a religion, right? And in this case, they established what was called the Amsterdam test, which is basically testing for when this is, the state can make these kinds of adjustments, or when religious freedom kicks in, as it were. So here we have a practice or belief that is a nexus with religion and which calls for particular conduct. And irrespective of this practice, whether it's required by religious dogma. And the second point is a person is sincere in their belief of this thing. So basically, these distinctions are important because you do get this idea between like low and high religion. And again, I'm using heavy air quotes there. But the idea of some religious practices being dictated by dogma, by religious texts, by religious authorities. And on the other hand, you have some religious traditions that aren't written down anywhere, but they just are. They're part of a person's folk tradition, their folk religion, their low religion, again, in air quotes. And one thing that's really interesting when you hit the literature on this is that there is a very strong gender distinction. The fact that a lot of scholars will not want to call things low religion is significant because that's tradition that's typically associated with women because they're not often allowed to be members of clergy. And so you have this really strong divide between these strong, authoritative, dogmatic religion as established by texts, as established by men, versus sort of the idea of low religion as folk tradition practiced by women. And again, how does the state judge which is religion? They're all religious practices. They all stem from religious beliefs. One might be written down, one might be practiced. There doesn't seem to be much of a difference. And the state was basically throwing up its hands with the Amsterdam test and saying it comes down to the sincerity of someone's belief. And that, of course, is a whole other kettle of fish. Like, how do you look into someone's mind and say, you are sincere in your belief? It becomes really problematic too because people's beliefs change, right? You could be sincerely committed to keeping kosher, and then just be like, actually, this is not for me, and go out and get yourself a Hawaiian pizza. That's fine. That's totally a personal subjective practice. But can we look at someone's past actions, like the fact that they got a Hawaiian pizza last week, and then deduce that they're not kosher now? It seems that the state is not in a position even to judge this. So basically, when we bring this back to the question of the clerk and the BC legislature, and it took me a while to get there, but I promise we get back here again, the clerk really can't make a decision as to what religious content to include, which religions to include and which ones not to include, who to talk to. Every single point when the clerk tries to make a decision, they're running up against this problem of picking one religion over another, favoring one religious tradition over another, or certain groups of religious traditions over others. And they're ultimately excluding some groups, and they're violating their duty of religious neutrality, as established in the 2015 Saguenay case. This is sort of the final court case which I'll touch upon before getting into some of the more practical problems. But Saguenay basically addressed the question of prayer in municipal governments. And in this case, the court vehemently ruled that it is unconstitutional for a municipal council meeting to begin with prayer. We have a forthcoming report on this looking across all British Columbia municipalities. Disappointingly, several of them still continue to have prayer at their inaugural meetings. And our amazing research team, Adriana particularly, has been diving into Manitoba and Ontario, where a significant number of municipalities continue to open their sessions with prayer despite the Saturday decision. The Saturday decision probably should apply to legislatures, but again, that still hasn't been tested out in the courts. But as we can see from all the sort of broader discussion around jurisprudence, it is the case that the state really can't pick one religion over another. And anytime it does so, it's unconstitutional. So, not only is it unconstitutional, but it's also practically impossible or incredibly challenging. So let's dive into some of the practicalities. So there's the first question of, once you've jumped over this insurmountable barrier of the Constitution and the importance of separation of religion and government, it gets to the question of which religions do you pick? And that is in and of itself a huge problem. So there's different approaches the clerk could take. The first approach is, the idea of bureaucratic familiarity. So, you say, we're familiar with these religions, these are the ones we're going to include in our list. That's a bit of a problem because it's incredibly subjective, right? The clerk could be just really into New Age mysticism and ask a bunch of New Age groups at the exclusion of some other conventional religious traditions. But not only that, you could rely on other kind of government precedent tables. There's something called the table of precedents, and this is a hierarchy of officials at official state functions, who is introduced in what order. It starts with the Queen and it works its way down. And if you look at this order of precedence, the federal list that is, you'll see that representatives of faith communities come right after premiers, but before justices, senators, and members of parliament. But unfortunately, the way that these kinds of table of precedents are ordered suggest, again, a real strong bias towards hierarchical and structured religions. They stipulate that the order within the representatives of faith communities is to be done along the lines of seniority, which again, not all religious traditions allow people to say, keep people in office for perpetuity. And so there's that kind of weird bias. And when we started going into the sort of weird web of the order of precedence tables for both the provincial and federal level, we started noticing that they all kind of, it becomes very circular very quickly with, we rely on the Navy's list or the military's list, and that list relies on another one. And ultimately it comes down to sort of the bureaucratic familiarity of certain faith traditions. And again, we don't know what counts as a religion. So, the fact that you're inviting dignitaries for various faith traditions suggests that you're only inviting faith traditions who can be represented by dignitaries. Not all religious traditions have people that represent them. And of course, what about non-religious folks? Is it the executive director of the BC Humanists? Should they be standing beside the archdeacon or the primate of an Orthodox tradition? Is that appropriate? Who picks who? Where do people go? There's these problems cannot be surmounted when it comes to bureaucratic familiarity. So then what about population demographics, right? We could take the survey of all British Columbians and say if 25% of British Columbians believe in X religion, then we're going to have 25% of these prayers, right? There's a couple of problems with this. And the first problem is basically the way that we record religion in our Statistics Canada, in our statistics. When StatsCan asks people about their religion, they ask, which religion do you identify with? And people will identify with a religion. But this doesn't necessarily connote belief. And this is a very real problem with the statistics. For example, a poll of people in Quebec, 75% of them identified as Catholic, but when polled on another occasion, only 28% of them strongly believed in a God. So you have people who are culturally associating with religious traditions, but not necessarily adhering to the beliefs of those religions. So when you ask people, what religion do you identify with, you're not necessarily asking them what do they actually believe or what are their practices. So that's a big problem. But there's other problems with the Statistics Canada and the way that we gather statistics. So one of them is that there's a lot of gaps in the list. You have a list of about 70 different religious traditions, but there's huge groups that are missing, and there's also a lack of specificity. So for example, there's 70 Protestant sects on that list, but Judaism is included in a single list. It seems a bit challenging to group Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Jews, and Reform Jews together in one category. They have vastly different practices, vastly different beliefs, and yet Anglicans and Baptists would be considered separate categories. So you start getting this, you start to see how every time the government makes a decision where to draw a line between Baptists and Anabaptists, or between Orthodox or Hasidic Jews, it's making a decision upon which it has no basis to do so, because it can't arbitrate dogma, but also because these questions aren't simple. Wars have been fought about very minute issues within religion. And so the state isn't empowered, nor is it capable of making these kinds of decisions. And then the fourth problem with using population demographics is, where do you draw the line, right? You have a list of all the different religions that are represented in British Columbia, But do you draw the line at 1%, 0.5%? If you draw the line at 0.5%, which allows you to include Judaism, that's 17 different religions. Now you have a very cumbersome list that includes a large number of different Protestant religions. And how do you pick between those? Do you lump them together? When you do that, as a state, you're ultimately, again, violating your duty of religious neutrality, and you're making decisions, religious decisions, which the state isn't capable of making. So another option would be to look at the demographics of the legislature, right? So for example, you could ask every MLA, what is their religion, if they have one, and then you can make sure that the list included the religious traditions of all the MLAs. But we can really see how problematic this becomes very quickly. First of all, it's super intrusive, right? You're violating the privacy of MLAs. But also, people's views change over time. So the fact that someone on a Tuesday might be Christian, maybe over the weekend they had a change of heart, or over the course of a 4-year session of the legislature, people change. Also, there's by-elections. And so you're constantly updating these lists in a very intrusive way. But not only that, but knowing the religious affiliation of an MLA, again, doesn't tell you how they practice that religion. So an MLA might declare themselves as being part of one religious tradition, but that doesn't tell you if they pray a certain way, which prayers they see are as appropriate. So the solution to this is, apart from abolishing legislative prayer, would be to let the MLAs deliver prayers themselves and not have a sample list. Because anytime you try to construct a sample list, you're ultimately going to be excluding people and making decisions that you don't have the basis to make from the perspective of the state. So on top of all that, let's say we've resolved that problem of which religions to include. Then we have the problem of which prayers from those religions to include, right? Because just because you say, oh, we're going to include Anglicans and Jews and Baptists, doesn't tell you anything about the prayers within those traditions. Anglicanism has tons of different prayers they deliver as part of their different ceremonies at different times of the year for different occasions. So which one of those prayers or ones of those prayers do you select, right? That becomes a huge problem, again, because the state is arbitrating dogma, saying this is a prayer that's acceptable, this one isn't. And it becomes really hard for non-hierarchical prayers. It's pretty easy to roll up and call up the Archbishop of the Catholic Church and ask them to submit a single prayer. But for very non-hierarchical traditions, like some of the evangelical movements within Christianity or different sects of Buddhism, who do you ask? There isn't just an authority you can ask. So that's the next question. What if you just ask different religious groups? So again, maybe it makes sense for some hierarchical religions, but it doesn't work for non-hierarchical ones. And even within a hierarchical religion, there are differences of opinion, which creates dogmatic schisms. There's been schisms in the last few years between Methodists and Anglicans. There's an emerging schism within Orthodox Christianity. So even if you had a structured hierarchical organization that you could ask to submit a prayer, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to submit one prayer. How do you choose between them? Without weighing in on one side, you ultimately can't pick between prayers. And as soon as you weigh in, you violated your duty of religious neutrality. And not only that, and this comes back to the gender issue, which is the vast majority of spokespeople for these hierarchical structured religions are men. And so you're only in the perspective of one segment of that religion. And again, that comes down to the question of high religion and low religion, again, using heavy air quotes. So not only that, but then there's a question of what about the non-religious, right? So yeah, let's say we can call up the Archbishop and a couple of deacons and get them to submit different prayers. But who do you ask to represent the non-religious? A poll from the BCHA from 2016, supported by our amazing members, found that 69% of British Columbians practice no prayer or do not participate in a religion or a faith. Okay, so that's a significant percentage of the population. So how do we represent them? Do we ask representatives of non-believers? Well, non-believers vary vastly in beliefs. You have humanists and atheists, but you may also have people who are just ambivalent and don't care, people with their own esoteric religious spiritual practices. So ultimately, religion comes down to such an individualistic decision that you have one religion per person in the province. And so, do you ask the BCHA to submit a prayer? Well, we did, by the way. We submitted a couple of prayers, and I'll read a couple of those in a bit because I think they're quite interesting and relevant for another argument here. But here's the interesting and the challenging thing. When it comes to things like atheists or humanists or non-believers, there is one thing that unites them, and that typically is a rejection of formalized religious practices. Asking them to so basically, asking people of these non-religion groups or non-believers to participate in a formalized ritualistic practice is in and of itself a little bit rich, right? I mean, you're in a sense asking people to participate in a process that they're not really supportive of. So what about the final option? What if you just asked British Columbians about their opinion on these matters, right? What if you said, hey, all right, we're just going to do a survey of all British Columbians. British Columbians, submit your prayers, right? Well, you start running into some other problems, right? First of all, you do solve some problems, by the way. You solve a lot of the problems I've just mentioned, but you do run into some other problems. First of all, when Ontario considered reforming its practices, so the Ontario legislature started with the Lord's Prayer for the longest time, and there was a plan to abolish that. The office of the clerk, or their office in charge of this, was flooded with 11,000 emails, and it crashed their server. Who were those mostly from? They were from people of different religious traditions because they're organized. They're more able to mobilize people. Non-believers don't really organize themselves, despite the fact that the BCHA is very active, in BC politics and around the country. Most non-believers don't organize around their non-belief. And so if you were to solicit responses from all British Columbians, you would get inundated by responses from belief organizations. And again, the state wouldn't have the ability to differentiate between them. In fact, apart from spelling and length, the state wouldn't have a basis to say this is a good prayer or this is a bad prayer, because they're the subjective reflections of people's beliefs. And as soon as the state makes a decision, it's choosing one particular version of a dogma over others, which the courts say it can't do. And also, there's no basis for making that decision, right? Even if it wasn't a constitutional question, if you had 5 prayers, you're the clerk, and you have 5 prayers laid out in front of you, it ultimately is a personal judgment call, which is kind of problematic when it comes to making very important decisions of state that affect lots of different people and have the potential to exclude groups or to side with one side in a religious conflict. But there's another challenge, and that is that some prayers that you could pick could overtly attack or offend members of other religious groups. And so you get the situation where in trying to include some religious traditions, you're inherently excluding others or offending others. And that becomes a problem. And so, for example, I'll read you one of the prayers that we submitted as a good option here. Because we thought it was a sound representation of humanist values, but you can probably see why it might be problematic or considered problematic for some folks. So let's see here, where's that one? There are almost certainly no gods. Therefore, let us commit ourselves to tackling the challenges that face our province with reason, wisdom, and empathy. I think that's probably a statement that most humanists could get behind, hopefully. But you can probably imagine it starting a statement like, there are almost certainly no gods, might offend many people who are religious. But again, you see this kind of tension because, of course, starting every prayer with, there is a God and we're going to pray to it or talk to it, again, excludes people who are non-believers. So we submitted that prayer intentionally as sort of a counterpoint to highlight the challenges that the clerk would face. So ultimately, this is just to sum up at this point, and we'll move into questions for a second. Every single time the clerk makes a decision, there are practical and there are constitutional challenges. And the constitutional challenges, I think, are insurmountable, right? I'll read a quote from Saguenay because it's the most prescient here. The Saguenay decision, the judge said, the state may not act in such a way as to create a potential public space that favors certain religious groups and is hostile to others. It follows that the state may not, by expressing its own religious preference, promote the participation of religion at the expense of non-religious, or vice versa. So basically, the state can't create a space that's preferential towards one group or another. And in selecting prayers for a sample list, in the case of the clerk here, it is doing just that. So this allowed us to conclude basically that anytime there is this, you start eroding the barrier of separation between religion and government, you run into problems that are insurmountable, both practically and constitutionally. This is ultimately why legislative prayer should be ended in British Columbia, but if it's not ended, the practice of having a sample prayer list should be abolished, because the existence of the sample prayer list is, again, a second layer of entanglement of the state with religion. So with that, I will open things up to questions. I encourage people to take a look at the whole paper. We go into a lot more detail around some of the jurisprudence and have a lot more numbers exploring some of the aspects around demographics, things like that. But yeah, thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Teal. That was very comprehensive. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, I wanted to ask you, where would you like to see things going forward now that this report has been released? Like, what is your ideal situation for the clerk's office to take on?
So when we wrote this paper, the clerk was still in the process of updating the sample prayer list and in the process of finishing the final edits to the peer review process. Academic publishing takes some time, with good reason. Peer review is very important. And as the peer review process was going through, we learned that the clerk had indeed updated the list. So we have a freshly updated list. The problem with the freshly updated list, as I mentioned earlier, is that it really, you do have an inclusion of specific prayers for specific religious groups. But again, you exclude many of them, and you also you still have a couple of sort of generic prayers. What's interesting about that sample list is that it includes an Indigenous territorial acknowledgement, which is kind of strange to include that within prayers, right? So MLAs are given the choice of delivering a prayer or something else. We started our meeting with the territorial land acknowledgement. Ian and I have written a paper called Arbiters of Faith, not Arbiters of Faith, that's this paper, Decolonizing the Prayer, which explores the question of legislative prayer in the BC legislature from an Indigenous perspective, rather not from an Indigenous perspective, but with a focus on Indigenous content. And so the idea that you have this new updated prayer list with territorial acknowledgement as one of the options is a bit problematic in and of itself, right? We've argued that the BC legislature should probably start with the territorial acknowledgement, and that the prayer should definitely be separate from that. So the new list has huge problems. But your question was more like, where do we go from here? So we've got a couple of ongoing projects. This paper is going to be followed by a book chapter where we look at how prayer has changed as a result of these two amendments. So as I mentioned at the top of the hour, the two practices around prayer that have changed is the clerk has updated their sample list, and the prayer session has been changed to prayers and reflections. So we ran a quantitative analysis to determine whether those two changes had an impact on the content, structure, and religiosity of the prayers in the BC legislature. And we found some interesting results. And so that's sort of the next step. And then the interesting thing with the structure of the research project that we set up around legislative prayer is that every few years we can go and look at how legislative prayer has changed over time. And so we're sort of tracking changes over time and looking at trends. So members can expect, if legislative prayer is not ended, an update report, chapter, article, or some sort from the BCHA every 2 to 3 years exploring this, because it's a changing and dynamic thing. And then there's a question here. I guess I can read that one off there. So for those who are just following along, it says, this is Ian writing, another thing we're curious to take on is to submit a freedom of information request to the clerk's office to find out, if we can, how their decision was made. That's right. So what was interesting about this paper was we were really speculating on all the different options available to the clerk. We think we pretty much covered them all. And so we were interested in figuring out which method the clerk ultimately used. As I mentioned, basically every single option is fraught with peril, but it'd be interesting to see which option they picked and why. I've got some questions here.
We have a question submitted by someone. I don't know if what Ian's saying is a question, but one of the questions submitted is, what does your ideal prayer look like?
Yeah, so this again is that kind of, perilous question of being like, asking people who don't believe in religious traditions to participate in a religious tradition, right? So we kind of held our nose and participated in the consultation. We're glad that we got asked to participate. Our submission to the clerk as part of their consultation was basically, in my opinion, a scathing indictment of legislative prayer. If you look at the House of Prayers report, which I linked earlier in the chat, we go through the philosophical, the legal arguments against legislative prayer, and then our quantitative analysis really shows that it's discriminatory and excludes tons of people. But not only that, like I've talked to people who are religious, and I've talked about prayer in the legislature, and members of the clergy, and they all agree the last person you want delivering a prayer is a politician. They're terrible at it. The fact that our research team found prayers that overtly threatened unions. There's one prayer where the person reading the prayer is praying that the HEU union will come to its senses and go back to the bargaining table. It sounds like a mafia boss reading a threat. It's definitely not appropriate. So even people who are religious should oppose legislative prayer, because it basically, it undermines something that they would consider sacred, right? It makes it theatrical, it makes it performative, it makes it part of politics, which is the last thing someone who takes their religion seriously wants to see. So, we definitely still oppose prayer. I think that wasn't quite the question, but we definitely still oppose the inclusion of legislative prayer. But if it must be done, we'd like it to be done sort of in a more inclusive way. And the question was, what is our ideal prayer? So in the paper, people can look at Appendix 2 on page 13, and we've submitted 6 prayers as sample humanist prayers. These were sort of written up by our committee, and so we definitely welcome other people's opinions. But the one that I liked the most was the first one, which was, there are almost certainly no gods. Therefore, let us commit ourselves to tackling the challenges that face our province with reason, wisdom, and empathy. There's two other ones I can read off for folks in case you're interested. We're trying to promote, humanist values here. So take a moment to look around the room at all the people here. In this moment, sharing together this extraordinary experience of being alive. Let us rededicate ourselves to working towards improving the lives of people of our province. Right, and I'll do one more here. We have within us all a shared humanity. Let us therefore treat one another with respect and dignity. Let us focus on what we have in common and not what divides us. Let us commit ourselves to applying reason and science, strengthened by empathy and compassion, in order to improve the lives of all British Columbians. So again, you can see we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. We're trying to really focus on making good, sound decisions. But the emphasis here was very much off any sort of religious content. But again, starting a meeting with a prayer comes from a very specific religious tradition. So again, we're trying to fit a sort of humanist peg in a religious hole, as it were. Any more questions here? Let's see.
Yeah, there's one from Jake. When changes are made and groups continue flaunting the new rules, what remedies are available?
That's a really good question. So there's two answers. The first answer is more research, right? The reason why we started all this project in the first place was whenever I was approaching people to raise concerns about legislative prayer, they would tell me, oh, no, legislative prayer is super inclusive, don't worry about it. We had a Jewish prayer last year, right? And but there was no way of knowing if the prayers themselves were inclusive or representative of British Columbians because no one had ever studied them before. And we couldn't just look at them because they were all only on video. So we had a team of 50 volunteers, some of you are here watching right now, transcribe all the prayers, then we ran our quantitative analysis, and then we figured out that no, the prayers were exclusionary. So to answer Jake's question more head on, the first one is to do good research and use that to convince people that they should change. So we're currently doing that at the municipal level. As I mentioned earlier, the Saturday decision very vehemently stipulates that you cannot start a municipal council meeting with prayer. In British Columbia, there were, this is off the top of my head, I think it was 23 to 25 municipalities that started their inaugural meetings in 2018 with a prayer. That was unconstitutional. Not a lot of those municipalities knew because the law was still quite new. So the first step the BCHA took was writing them a polite letter to let them know that the practice was unconstitutional. They should not do so in the future. And a lot of the municipalities we wrote to responded with a very affirmative response. Oh, sorry, we didn't know. A couple of them kind of pushed back a little bit. The next step is going to be to watch the next set of inaugural municipal meetings in 2022. And that will allow us to see if those outliers have followed the Constitution. If they haven't at that point, the firmness of our letters would certainly change. And obviously, that would be a case of the BC Human Rights Tribunal or courts because it is an overt constitutional violation. When it comes to the legislature, it probably will have to be decided by the courts at some point. In a couple of court cases, which we explore more in House of Prayers a little bit, there is the question of parliamentary privilege. So right now, parliamentary privilege protects a lot of content in the legislature, but there was a dissenting opinion in a case in Ontario where the judge said, yes, but parliamentary privilege doesn't give you the right to discriminate overtly, right? Like parliamentary privilege is there to protect legislators so they can say whatever they want in the House, to protect them from being sued for libel or slander and things like that. But if there was a rule in the BC legislature that said this group is not allowed, women are not allowed, members of this religious group are not allowed, LGBTQ people are not allowed, that wouldn't be protected by parliamentary privilege. That would be a world gone topsy-turvy and a constitution and a charter of rights and freedoms on fire. So ultimately, whether parliamentary privilege protects prayer is not yet been decided, but I think the case is very strong that it shouldn't. But yeah, at this point, the best thing you can do is to support the BCHA in our ongoing work. And if it does get to the courts, we might need some more support because those things can go on for a while. There's more questions here. Sorry about that. That was me talking for a bit of time. But yeah, be ready to fundraise because, yeah, I think Renil wrote, be ready to fundraise. We're currently looking at other provinces for municipal prayer, and we're finding some very startling results in other provinces. So keep your eyes open for those reports. We'll be releasing them over the next few months. Any other questions?
Has asked a clarification. What does your ideal prayer list prepared by the Office of the Clerk look like if there has to be one?
Brilliant. I have something for this. Let me show you. Where is it? Here it is. That's a blank paper for those of you listening at home. There shouldn't be a list. And if there was a list, it should be, we call for a moment of silent reflection. And if that's unacceptable, the next backup should be a list of exclusively secular prayers. There shouldn't be any religious content on there at all. And if there does have to be religious content on there, and these are all sort of fallback points, then the vast majority of them should be secular. and if they're religious, they should be as vague as possible. And we go over these in detail at the end of House of Prayers report, but basically working our way down a hierarchy of preferences. And yeah, so Janice is saying, wondering about the pushback from a blank page. In a sense, there already is a blank page because MLAs can deliver a prayer of their own devising, right? So, you know, the sample prayer list is about 50% of the prayers are from the sample prayer list. And so an easy solution would be just to abolish the sample prayer list and have MLAs use their own opinion. Because ultimately, who's the best arbiter of your own personal faith? You are. And so if MLAs want to deliver prayers that are religious, they should bloody well write them themselves and not rely upon the clerk to do that for them in a process that just doesn't work.
Yeah, awesome. Does anybody have any more questions?
Yeah, and so Janice made a comment about, Ian made a comment about decolonizing legislative prayer. I'd encourage people to take a look at that. One of the things that a lot of people are shocked to learn is that the legislature starts with prayer, and then on top of that, they're shocked to learn that there isn't a territorial land acknowledgement, or territorial acknowledgement, or traditional welcome, or something. You know, Ian and I recognized, writing it from the perspective of two settlers, that it was not appropriate for us to say what that process should look like. And if the legislature wanted to develop appropriate welcome ceremony, they should do so in consultation with the vast number of Indigenous stakeholders. So it wasn't for us to say, but at the same time, it's a bit shocking that you'd have a process that excludes many people when there's already a great way of starting meetings that includes people, that also contributes to reconciliation. So I think that's a bit of a problem. And actually, just backing up to Jack's question as well, or Jake's question, sorry, you can also just let your MLA know. Not a lot of folks realize that it's not hard. Obviously, we're in an election cycle right now, but after the election's over, pick up the phone and let your MLA know. A lot of them have their own personal views, but they're easily swayed by someone just picking up the phone and giving them a call. Sometimes they'll give you very strange responses as well, as we've been experiencing with some of our communications with municipalities recently. And that's also quite telling as well. I'll leave that tease for a future date.
Do you think any of the current BC election candidates would be responsive to this? Like, has anyone tried talking to them about it? Yeah, so early on in the process, back to the House of Prayers report, we reached out to every MLA in a couple of capacities. We asked them 5 or 6 survey questions about their opinion on legislative prayer, and we got mixed responses. And so some of them were vehemently, doubled down and defended the process, and then some of them were quite supportive of abolishing the process. And I know some of them spoke to our executive director, perhaps off the record, more informally, about how they supported this process, and that helped sort of move us along and buoy our spirits that there was an interest in doing so. So yeah, there's definitely some MLAs that are supportive of this. I don't know, I wouldn't speak to which ones, because I think most of them have talked to us in confidence, but it'll be interesting to see the makeup of the new legislature, and also to track how the new legislative assembly changes with prayer. One of the things I'm really excited about is our forthcoming book chapter, which looks at how the prayers have changed as a result of the two changes. We did a bunch of analysis. Our amazing analysis person, our quantitative guru, or Yoda, if you will, Katie, ran a ton of great analysis that we weren't able to use in the book chapter. So we're probably going to come up with some future work specifically looking at age and gender and how that influences prayer religiosity in the BC legislature. And the final thing I would say, just as I'm vamping on this one last point, is we have an amazing data set. So if anyone out there is interested in doing their own research into the prayer, it's all publicly available. You can access our database and our data set and run your own numbers and look for other features, because there's a rich set of data. I was talking to a gentleman who was a retired theology professor, and he was saying, you'd be interested in looking at the type of prayers that are delivered. For example, there's different kinds of prayers. There's petitionary prayers where you're asking for something. There's prayers of thanks where you're thanking the deity for something. So someone could conceivably analyze all the prayers looking for those features and find some very interesting results. So the question was, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say Jake asked a question, but I'm sure.
It says, are you getting any support from the feds, either government or humanist organizations? So at the federal level, the Senate and the House start with a prayer, but it is not open to MLAs. In fact, if people are interested, we recently released another report, and I don't have this one totally handy, but it is on the banner of the BCHA website. We released a report surveying legislative prayer across Canada, and there's considerable diversity of practices. So for example, Newfoundland and Labrador, their legislature has never started with prayer. Quebec abolished the practice of prayer and now has silent reflection. Only a couple of jurisdictions have an MLA's choice option to the territories in British Columbia. And then the rest of the provinces tend to have either a prayer that's read by the speaker or a standard prayer or a list of prayers they cycle through, or they read the Lord's Prayer or an adaptation of the Lord's Prayer. And there's been a lot of efforts in different jurisdictions to change this. We go into those in more detail in a couple of our other papers. And most of those have been unsuccessful apart from whatever happened in Quebec. Well, we know the silent revolution happened in Quebec. So whatever happened in Quebec and in Ontario, when they tried to change it, the Lord's Prayer was not abolished, but the Ontario legislature now reads the Lord's Prayer and then a prayer from a standard list of, including a couple of other religious traditions. We have reached out to some other humanist organizations across the country. To be honest, the BCHA is one of the most active in the country as far as research output and activism, and we have the most amazing and active members. But we are reaching out to other organizations, particularly around our municipal prayer survey. So we will soon have a report for every province that says which municipalities in that province adhere to Saguenay. And the idea would be to help work with partners in other provinces to reduce the number of municipalities that are breaking the Constitution by opening their sessions with prayer. And we're finding an alarming number, in fact, that are. And it's not always just inaugural meetings. In British Columbia, it's exclusively inaugural meetings. But in Manitoba, we have daily prayer. So every meeting of a legislature, of a city council starts with a prayer. Some of those are often read by a councillor, rather, switch my brain to the municipal level, read by a councillor. That is not constitutional, according to the Saguenay decision. So we're going to be reaching out to other organizations to work with them to ensure that separation of religion and government is supported across the country.
Perfect. Yeah, do we have any other questions, or is that it for tonight? Oh, one more from Jake. So he asks, why is it not the federal government that is removing these prayers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Part of it, I think, is there hasn't been enough call for doing so, right? Governments will often not take action unless they're forced or vehemently argued in favor. There's a groundswell of support for doing something. And as I mentioned earlier in my talk, it's very difficult for people to organize around non-belief, right? Like, we haven't formed a Sasquatch Denial Association, or Sasquatch Non-Believers Federation is probably more appropriate. And nor do people get together to celebrate unicorns unless you're at a Browning convention. And so basically, it's hard to get that kind of mobilization and groundswell of support. And you tend to get this sort of the argument from tradition, this is how we do it. And there's a lot of sort of static and people, entities like the legislature have traditions that last for a long time, and it's difficult to change them. But you can see lots of change. There's promise, right? So for example, we got change when the legislature here in BC changed from prayers to prayers and reflections. The legislature quickly changed when they realized that their dress code was overtly sexist, right? And so you can have these quick changes to procedures and practices that have been around for hundreds of years. And it's just a matter of bringing attention to them, which is why we have such a strong research section, but also campaigning around them. So getting people to write to their MLAs and participating in different campaigns, because otherwise governments just won't take the initiative to make change typically. And someone say, yeah, look what happens when O Canada is changed. Yeah, I mean, O Canada was adapted. There's still problems with our national anthem, both the French and English version, right? And those themselves probably also violate the separation of religion and government. And then you do still have ghosts of previous religions held into legislation, like the preamble to the charter. So there's all these aspects, and one has to pick and choose what one targets. If I had my way, I'd probably be focusing more on hats and dress codes in legislatures. And we might do a paper on the order of precedence table, but it's very obscure legislative content. And then Renil was writing that the French version of Canada is pretty bad. Yeah, the French version is very overtly religious in many ways, with imagery as well. And that would be, if one was aspiring to a more secular society, one might want to look to that. Yeah, someone was just saying that back in the day, folks would sing "God Save Our Land." I mean, prayer happened in schools. When I was reading about past cases, the Big M drug mart was 1985, right? So, these changes are happening quite quickly. And I think as our society becomes both more secular and as we recognize the importance for diversity, you'll start seeing these changes. But you need to have something to catalyze them. And I see the BCHA as having a central role in catalyzing a lot of these changes at all levels of government.
Do you have any final thoughts to wrap up your talk today, Teal?
I think that's a pretty good spot to end. I would encourage people to keep up to date on our research. And if you have ideas for research, do send them along. We have a whiteboard that has many ideas on it. There's lots of work to be done. And we set ourselves a really ambitious goal of looking at every municipality in the country. There are 3,700 of them. So our research team is quite literally looking at the minutes of every single municipal council in the country, which is fine and dandy when you've got large municipalities like Burnaby or Toronto or Calgary, but it starts getting real challenging when you get into some very small communities. And so it's been a huge undertaking, but at the end of that project, we're going to have a really good understanding of how effective a Supreme Court ruling like Saguenay is on changing practice. Because I think Jake was asking, and some other folks were asking about, how do we get these changes to occur? If we go through the courts, the next question is that ruling going to be followed? Directly after the Saguenay decision, there was a host of mayors and councillors that explicitly said that they would continue to pray at their municipal council meetings despite the Saguenay decision. So it's really important that we look in to see this as the case and to see how powerful court decisions actually are. And the other thing I will add is we are currently putting together an edited book on secular politics in Canada. The BCHA has been churning out so much research that we thought we would invite other scholars to contribute works to an edited book. So we're going to be doing a call for submissions for that in a couple of months. So if you have a project or something that you're more academic bent, and you have a project you're working on or interested in working on, get in touch, because we'd be happy to hear your submission for the book chapters. And again, that's an important way of sharing our research with different communities. So, what we're doing right now is outreach to the public, but when we produce, peer-reviewed content like this article, we're introducing our ideas into different segments of thought, different communities. And that's a really important way to change society, is to change ideas at different levels. And that's one thing I think the BCHA has been excelling at doing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Teal, today for coming and sharing your huge wealth of knowledge on this with us. Very helpful for everyone, I think, and knowing the inner workings of clerk's office and all that. Ian just said in the chat that we have our donation page open, which helps keeps events like this going. So definitely check that out. But yeah, and thank you so much, everyone. Hopefully I'll see you all in 2 weeks for the climate panel, and hope you have a good rest of your nights.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye.
Bye.